What's up, prehistoric people of the modern millennia? Sounds pretty familiar, right? LCC number 71, Left Coast Caveman is supreme being through modern hunting and gathering. Nutritional modalities, fitness modalities, and mentalities brought to you for supreme being. Not the antithesis of supreme being, that which you see in the world today. Worried about this, worried about that. Fear, anxiety, stuffing one's face with fast food, packaged goods, chemicals, anything you wish to add. We are not that. We are. Go ahead.
No, that's good. I'm just going to agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what we've been talking about recently with 69, LCC 69, you can find us at leftcoastcaveman.com under the media section or under articles, under cast at leftcoastcaveman.com. You can go to our YouTube links, Left Coast Caveman, search Left Coast Caveman. You can find this information. Left Coast Caveman is abbreviated LCC, and on our socials is LCC Left Coast Caveman CVMN. That's not to say that we disclude the ladies. It's Left Coast Cave ladies as well. Left Coast implies modern technology, integrating technology, but caveman is not what you'd think, not a hairy imbecile of a human being, but somebody who's rooted in what human beings, Homo sapiens, ought to be doing every single day. And that is what we bring to you at leftcoastcaveman.com. And what we've been searching recently and discovering and discussing here on the cast is primarily nutritional modalities. Eat the Earth modality we talked about, LCC 69, and then 70 we followed that up with washing vegetables, which turned into a conversation around organic and not organic, and turned into, well, what does one do if one can't afford these high-end ingredients in their modern hunting and gathering, and therefore need to implement other nutritional modalities for the sake of getting high-end nutrition and removing harmful pathogens from their food, which led us to a conversation around the art, the science, the ancient technology of fermentation. And you've had some exciting experiments this week that you've been actualizing, and that's why I included our actualization glyph. So Left Coast Caveman is also a system. It is a system of well-being. It is a process. It is not, contrary to influence or influenza, which tells you what to do, we are a community of individuals dedicated to supreme being, and we invite people to apply these modalities that we talk about to their life and see if it doesn't lead you to having more energy, having more clarity, having more focus, being able to deal with stress better, being able to deal with your occupation better, and then start to focus on what is your life unifying purpose around what you're doing? Why are you doing what you're doing? Knowing that why and applying that why towards a path of supreme being. That is what this actualization is all about. And we share that all at leftcoastcaveman.com. And we share that within the Apex Actualization community. You click Join the Cave, you're going to get free tools at leftcoastcaveman.com to introduce you to this way of life. But as you progress through the systems, first is Primal Primers, then is Sapient Strength, and the final but never final, the final stage of Supreme Being is an ongoing stage of Apex Actualization, during which we continue to discuss modalities in modern hunting and gathering and apply them to our lives and see how they work. See what they lead to. And you've been Sir Sylvester, my Supreme Being Alliance #1, OG Left Coast Caveman. Sir Sylvester has been experimenting with fermentation. What have you found thus far this week?
Yeah. So when it comes to Apex Actualization, that's where it really gets exciting, because no longer are you simply reading the book of others, but this is where you start authoring your own and sharing it out with your cave community. So that being said, last week we landed on fermentation and some of the thoughts behind how it arose and how we can include it in our everyday lives and maybe revive some of those ancient practices that have been lost. So it's interesting to see how long fermentation has been around for, and likely longer than what the history tells. But it looks as evidenced by residues on clay pots and across the world in China 9,000 years ago. Looks like they were doing fermentation with primarily with a rice fruit type beverage. They were fermenting rice and fruits. And then if you look at ancient Sumeria, which is like modern day Iraq and Turkey and Syria in that Fertile Crescent, that's really where, at that time was they were more focused on grains and barleys and wheats. And so you see evidence of fermented breads and fermented beers, interestingly enough. So just kind of cool to see how both of these arise around the same time frame, anywhere from 9 to 8,000 years ago. And it's uncertain as to if this was technologies that were discovered on their own, or if this was evidence of a sharing of ideas across cultures. So it's likely a little bit of both, but I think it's really interesting the fact that we have co-evolved with this technology of fermentation for a great deal of our modern day. And if you think about, I mean, that same time frame, that's around the time when we started departing from being nomadic hunters and gatherers and started laying stake and understanding kind of how to terraform the planet and really getting a grip on how to have dominion over one's environment. And of course, this was a quite the hard learning process as there was many famines in between, and it did leave different communities up to at the will of the environment as well. Meaning like, hey, they planted all their crops, and for whatever reason, there was a drought, and well, they're less mobile now, and they're in need of nutrients, and they might have to seek it as opposed to having it grown from the ground. But thankfully, our ancestors, they kept on path with this idea, this understanding of taming the environment and specialization of labor, and well, here we are today. Um, yeah, I mean the benefits of fermentation are longstanding, and I believe you went through them last week. But just to name off a few benefits, obviously it's a great way to preserve food, and that's probably one of the reasons why it arose to begin with. I don't think they quite understood why things were fermenting, but they did acknowledge the fact that it did allow foods to last longer without spoiling, and anywhere from 1 month to a year with more modern technologies. But I mean that's quite a leap in terms of keeping nutrients throughout times of hardship. Also, it was a way of making certain foods safer. Interesting enough, and I think that was one of the big stories behind beer. Is it allowed water. Through the fermentation process, you're able to cultivate different bacteria strains. You're also able to get rid of certain more harmful pernicious bacteria strains. And so through the fermentation process, you made a safer beverage that were less risk prone as like say standing water that you might find, or if you're not near a really clean fresh source. So there's definitely some safety, some longevity and safety attributes of fermented beers and such. But also it's a way of providing your body with like think of it as a pre-digested item. You can allow these, and also a good analog of this is thinking about what cooking meat did for human beings, right? Once we discovered fire, once we started really cooking meats, we were able to unlock more nutrients, make it more bioavailable for us. And it's kind of a similar, and I mean, obviously that's right around the time where the human brain started really getting larger, and there's all sorts of leaps and bounds in terms of invention, innovation, and cultural practice and collaboration. So thinking through fermentations takes a similar path. It's somewhat pre-digested through the bacteria and makes certain minerals, certain vitamins more bioavailable for us. So obviously that's a great thing if you want to maximize the impact of your fuel, as well as being both prebiotic and probiotic, and those being probiotic as in you're introducing certain beneficial bacteria into your body, which if you don't do that, or if you have more pernicious bacteria in your body, like obviously that's a problem that leads to all sorts of maladies that we're currently experiencing. I would say more so than ever, but also providing the fuel for which the more beneficial bacteria can utilize. And if they don't have that fuel, they start using you as that fuel. And that's a whole issue with the mucosal lining, and that can cause things such as leaky gut and all sorts of other inflammation diseases of the body. Um, I think that pretty much covers some of the benefits of fermented foods. And then obviously just the ways you can ferment foods. I mean, vegetables, cabbage, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, dairy in the form of yogurt, kefir, certain cheeses, legumes, which I'm less familiar with. And I don't know if you have any experience with them, but miso, tempo, natto, and then beverages being beer, kombucha, and then meats, which is another one that kind of slipped by me. And I haven't had a lot of good experiences with more healthful versions, but apparently certain sausages and salamis are the product of fermentation, which I didn't know.
Yeah, Genoa salami, and they use wine to ferment meats, and probably there is correlation with. I would assume that there is correlation with longevity and individuals who consume on a more regular basis this this type of food for the reasons that are well documented, and that some of which we just touch on briefly, and which you just went over, and then I sort of touched on the last cast. It's pretty well documented of the health benefits of fermented foods, whether that's nutritional boosting or improving the microbiota in the gut, and where the microbiota has systemic effects throughout the person, whether that's better immunization, better energy, better cognitive ability, whatever that is. And I like how you draw the same parallel with cooking meats. Essentially, we talk about this at Left Coast Caveman as well, is just this managing your energy metric, and what are you applying that energy towards. So no longer is your body having to work double time to break down and reduce all of the toxic effects of food in order to extract the nutritional benefits. Well, now that's being done through a fermentation process, and so you're absorbing more of the nutrients and your ability to use that energy elsewhere. And so where does that energy go to? Well, it goes towards supreme being. You can apply that now towards other things, and I like how you position it as this technology evolved with us. But as you introduced it too, you said reviving ancient practices, and what I find very interesting is and very underpinning to our purpose at Left Coast Caveman is not a, hey, we're introducing new ideas. It's how do we hunt and gather all of that which has been lost, and look at the way people are living lives, and is this, as we say, applicable to surviving and thriving? Are you thriving? Honestly, if you look at your life, are you thriving? And what is the root cause of you not thriving or not achieving higher levels of being, supreme being, versus what is contributing to better well-being, and what could you add to your regiment to increase your level of well-being? And introducing these foods that have better nutritional benefits and improve your microbiota, and have thus like a systemic effect on your overall sense of well-being and your health and your energy and all of that, and your ability to fight off disease. I mean, how much time do you take being fighting off illnesses? And so especially during the cold and flu season, as this eating of seasonality was introduced and this eating the earth modality was introduced. But before I go on to like the cultural those cultural components of it that I find fascinating, you were looking into some specific fermentation modalities with regard to immunization, were you not?
Yeah, so came across this really interesting recipe, and I believe it originated in Iran. And it's this idea of combining a few really healthful items in the ferment process. So last night I started my first batch of honey fermented garlic, which doesn't sound super tasty. I mean, I don't know, maybe it will be. And apparently, when it's done, the garlic turns black, which that in itself is probably an interesting visual. But just taking these two, really healthful items, obviously honey, local honey, just a myriad of different health benefits. I mean, one that strikes out most to me is managing inflammation, and I believe there's some like linkages to potentially helping ameliorate different like allergies with season and such. I don't know how true that one is, but definitely the anti-inflammation properties of honey. And then you look at garlic, and we touched on that last week as being one of those super root foods that are, obviously harvested near the fall, late summer, fall time. And it's just such a powerhouse when it comes to immunity, anti-inflammation. And there's some great studies out there showing just how powerful garlic is in terms of antiviral, antimicrobial, bacterial. I mean, the list goes, and everybody knows intuitively, like, oh, garlic, I'm not feeling good. I want to eat some garlic. I want to have a garlic soup. I want garlic chicken. Um, so combining the best of both worlds into a fermented option, I think it's going to be an interesting experiment at the very least. And we'll see. It takes about, on average, they say anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for the fermentation process to complete. And I was also thinking about adding some salt into it, which is touching on more the sapien, the apex actualization side of it. It's like, how do we take these ancient and recipes, and how do we improve on them? How do we add our own how do we create something new out of something old? And thinking through, well, that salt is definitely a part of the fermentation process, and salt's a great additive as well. It might even prolong the shelf life of this product, but also perhaps other anti-inflammation items you can add to that. Some turmeric, some onions. So I mean, the list goes on. I'm not getting too crazy with the experimentation just at this time. I'm going to do a few reps first before, but yeah, excited to share out how the honey fermented garlic will go in the next few weeks.
I'm excited to try it as well. And excellent point on essentially what apex actualization is. And if you go to leftcoastcaveman.com under Cave Culinary, is where we do take some of these ancient technologies and caveify them. Or just taking recipes and caveify them. How do we reduce the sugar content of them? How do we remove some of these harmful ingredients that are ubiquitous in consumer packaged goods in the grocery stores, and rewrite that recipe to be cave approved and to boost it with additional nutritional benefits based on modern hunting and gathering? That the fact that we can go into a grocery store and just open, like as you mentioned on the last, you had a good illustration of just magically opens up the door and you have the whole world essentially at the swipe of a debit card or a credit card, opens it up. And that is the left coast part of the caveman. It's we do acknowledge the fact that being a Neanderthal is not the best state of being. Supreme being implies left coast is great. It's fascinating. It's fantastic that we can have all of these highly powerful nutritional modalities at the swipe of a card. But the interesting dichotomy to that is, why should we need to revive these ancient practices? You ask most people how they feel about fermented foods, and I would say a good majority of them would be like, I don't know, it's sauerkraut, it's stinky, it's gross, it's weird. Or mushrooms tend to have an adverse effect to people. I don't know, like mushrooms, gross, weird. And these are some of nature's most powerful foods. Mold, bacteria. Oh, did you know that you're primarily made of bacteria? Ooh, gross, weird. No, we want clean, we want packaged, we want to rip open a clean sanitary package of triple washed vegetables. And this is where we've ended up. And this is why Left Coast Caveman exists. Is you and I are CPG people from trade. Is we have an expert's approach to what's in products and why, and where are products positioned and how are they sold into people, us in the marketplace. That is modern hunting and gathering. And so what this begs, the question that it begged and what it begs now is, where are there places where these modalities were not lost? Or is there a correlation? And we've discussed this throughout the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 casts. We've introduced the idea of, well, is there something a little bit more nefarious going on? Can we draw correlations between where people consume these nutritionally dense ancient technologies in their way of life? Is it more supreme than places where people consume primarily CPG products with not cave approved ingredients? And are there cultural implications to that, to why people live the way they live, why people value what they value? Why are people okay with just going and sitting under fluorescent lights all day and just doing a job that they can't stand, and living a life that essentially, if they're being brutally honest with themselves, is not supreme? If they had to write the book of their own life and say, this is supreme being is this to me, it would look something completely different than what they're actually doing day in and day out. And is there a correlation between what they're consuming and that state of being? A little bit complex way to introduce the topic, I know. I'm trying to zero in on where we left off, and what where we're going with this is, well, can we find these practices? Is there places in the world where, referred to as blue zones, typically, let's just call them caveified zones? Are there cave approved areas in the world with modalities that we have written about in Primal Primers or Sapient Strength, where there's a heavier concentration of those modalities, and thus more life to their years rather than years to their life, and or both. We talked about that last week as well. Just people are wanting to add more life to their years, or years to their life, but really what they should be doing is more life to their years. And can we find places in the world where that exists? Because you and I mean, what has happened with you since the left coast caveman way of life has become your central focus and the conduit through which you make decisions? And so trying to find that out in the world, is where I think this goes. And I've done some interesting research, but before I try to kick this off in the last 15 or 10 minutes that we have, yeah, I mean, like, your thoughts on this idea of why should we have to revive the ancient practice? Well, I think, yeah, I mean, let me just leave it at that. Like, why do you commenting on, like, the fact that, do you think most people find fermentation or these highly nutritional foods like fungus, why do they find that more, I would say, over the last decade, that's been considered, it's a little less acceptable. It's more acceptable, I'd say, now within the last couple of years, thanks to influencer influenza. But why we found ourselves in this position?
I
And then
think,
I'm gonna grab my notes.
yeah. So like most things in the contemporary modern day, they've been replaced and we've forgotten. I would bet that not 100 years ago, most families would still, do something called canning. They would can their vegetables, or they would ferment their own vegetables, because it's a really simple process. Literally, if you have some jars and you've got your vegetables and you cut them up and you add them to a salt brine, you literally can have, within 2 to 4 weeks, your fermented vegetables. And I think as things got more modern and the grocery industrial complex became more ubiquitous, and around every corner you can purchase an article of food prepackaged for your convenience, as opposed to having to make it yourself. I think that substituted, and in the act of convenience, and of course, like, is cost effective also. I mean, now more so than ever, but I think it was just a forgetting of these items, and it no longer became a practice, a family practice. As before, we were more reliant on ourselves and what we could create in our homesteads. Whereas now, I mean, think about it, you get a rip in your pants. What do? You throw it away and get a new one. We're this, like, totally disposable. We'll outsource all of our efforts to other people and other companies, and which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I think there certainly was some sacrifices made, and one of them being, the idea of fermented foods. And if you go into any supermarket, you'd be hard pressed to find a sauerkraut, a kimchi, a natto, or, I mean, it's not. I mean, there's a great deal of kombuchas. That one's become fairly mainstream, more so recently. But thinking more about the ones with the heavier fiber content, which I would say is probably a better leveraged item to consume and include in your everyday fueling strategies. But it's hard to find those items. Harder. I mean, 1 to 2 SKUs max. I mean, I go to Trader Joe's and they've got 2 fermented items there, and I buy them every week until I start making my own, which is a little project we'll be running this weekend. But I think that's primarily what happened. It is just people forgot. It's just over few generations, you just forget about these things that were once staples, and you've substituted those with just CPG bullshit. Like, not. you're no longer making and fermenting your own yogurt. You're buying this other quote unquote yogurt that, doesn't have a fraction of the bacteria strains or the bacteria strains that you even want to inoculate your body with. And you instead your body instead of yeah, I mean, I think there's just been a transition into more convenient packaged items, and those ones and have fallen to the wayside, unfortunately.
Which brings me to an interesting. You mentioned GT's kombucha and the fact that you and I are CPG experts and have worked in this industry for a collective 30 years now is important because we have a little bit of historical record internally with regard to what was most popular and why. I mean, at one point in my CPG career, Mountain Dew was, well, you can't keep it on the shelf. Probably still the case. I haven't looked at the IRI data in a while, but I remember the rollout and the disruption that GT kombucha created, and essentially created its own section, the UPG ultra pressed juice category, during which now produce managers are dedicating 4 foot refrigerated open sections to this product that a year ago was not even on the shelf. And so it and the same thing happened with like Kavita. And the brand managers at Kavita said, you know why this is so important is because when somebody buys it, they realize it's medicine and then they rebuy it. Which brings me to again, unpacking this idea of how we ended up where we ended up. Commercial, and I like how you refer to it as the grocery industrial complex. How did big CPG and the grocery industrial complex altogether hijack people's health, wellness, and well-being through products that they think are good for them? We'll have to kick off the Blue Zone topic next week because there's so much good research on here and comparing and contrasting modern hunting and gathering in these different places. I can't wait till next week essentially to talk about it, because you'll see the CPG hand at play in the places where there's highest levels of heart disease, obesity, disease-related death. That's where the biggest CPG brands have their strongest footprint. And so I'm getting off topic, but thinking about they're playing on a human mechanism that is probably written about somewhere in psychology and is probably something I'm going to butcher just by through thought process trying to unpack this. But think about desire and think about innate desire versus immediate desire. When you're eating kimchi regularly, when you're keeping it cave, when you're keeping your nutritional modalities completely cave approved, then you're not executing all these what we would refer to as debauchery modalities in the left coast caveman way of life, and added sugar, alcohol, packaged foods. When you're less inclined to go with the easy route of this quick, just grab it from the store, rip open the package and eat it, and you're actually going through the effort of meal prepping, cave meal prepping, going through cave culinary, ensuring that your meals are cave approved. You build within you this desire, like the Kavita brand manager was talking about. Well, people will come back and buy it. Why? Because they realize, let food be thy medicine. Another left coast caveman borrowed principle, let's say. But it recreates this desire within you. And it's an innate desire. It's not exactly like at the forefront, like grabbing you. And being aware of that requires some level of consciousness and requires some level of repetition and in practice. And that's why we don't refer to our nutrition as diets. It's because it's a completely change of paradigm of mind of what you think about food and intentional eating and all of these practices that we talk about, these modalities that we introduce in Primal Primers. If you go to leftcoastcaveman.com, select Join the Cave, you'll get a copy of it for yourself. All right, time running out, but let me contrast that real quick. We got 10 more minutes, and contrast that real quick with immediate desire. There's your debauchery modalities. That's the one that, like, if the more you do debauchery, the more you have that immediate desire. That's why CPG works. Oh, let's make it look good. Let's make it. I mean, even companies like Bimbo, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo can openly on their brand About Us section say things like creating nutritious food for the well-being of people. And it's like, really? They get away with this. That's accepted because of this, I think, more immediate desire of, yeah, sure, they probably do at the micro level have items that are, or at least have the leverage, let's say, to execute on that mission statement if they wanted to. But it doesn't make that much money, and that's why they don't. Is because, but they like food scientists can play on this immediate desire. It's like, well, that's good because it's green and it says all natural, and because it's in it's a vegetable. It's a a naked juice is a vegetable. No, you're drinking down a highly processed 45 grams of sugar. I don't care what you say, that's not good. It's better than drinking down a Coke, yeah, but it's not good. But anyway, this immediate desire versus this innate desire, I think, is where they've made their mark. But I do see that the tides are shifting and that people are becoming more conscious, especially as health has taken a significant decline. Recent research, death is increasing, disease related death increasing, and I can't wait till next week till we start to dig into the actual details of this and pairing them to the modalities that we teach at leftcoastcaveman.com. And so if you're not a subscriber, subscribe. If you're not at joining the cave, I would highly recommend at this point to follow up because the next few weeks are going to be bangers.
Yeah, I mean, dude, you hit it. You really hit it there. I mean, in terms of, I don't think it's a huge conspiracy initially. I think it's mostly profit oriented, but also like how do you cut down on expenses, on cost to produce, and then also it's becoming it's a competitive environment. So how do you have that upper edge to convince people to put your items in their shopping carts, and especially after let's say trial number one, how do you ensure that they proceed to a trial number 2 and 3 and 4 with said items? And that's where it does get into some more nefarious aspects of CPG, food science, and such, and the ways that they utilize ingredients to help really tug at these ancient instincts that we all have within us to consume calories and to drop a load of dopamine every time you do consume this huge bolus of calories. Because, I mean, keep in mind, we mostly spent our time as human beings in a time when nutrients weren't guaranteed. And when you did find them, though, you wanted to get them in. That's why we have this amazing ability to store fat, right? That's that's essentially like energy for another time. That's your energy bank, is your fat. And if you once you start exceeding the amount that you can put in your muscles through glycogen store in your liver, well, then you start converting it to fat. And say you're hunting and gathering, you come across a fig tree, you're going to sit that tree and probably gorge yourself, right? One, they're delicious, and two, like there is such a strong drive to like bank that food for later on where there are no fig trees, or the fig trees, the fruits are no longer there, or the season has changed. And so with that context, we look at going into the grocery store. Well, all those items, there's a benefit to CPG companies, to food scientists, to ensure that these foods have a requisite amount of sugar to stimulate that dopamine, right? And then you look at other ways that they preserve these foods. And I listened to a cast the other day where they talked specifically about Toll House cookies and talked about how there was a certain change some years ago in terms of like before they were kind of crappy, right? They weren't very good. And then all of a sudden they became like, when you pull them out of the package, you notice that they're kind of glittering like with sugar, and like it was crystalline. It was amazing, and it tasted better. And what's interesting about sugar is also a form of a preservative, which I didn't know. So you can better preserve items by adding more sugar into them. And then obviously you get into the whole trans fats things, and that's where you really make it tasty. You add these trans fats and it just completely stimulates that umami, that flavor within. And I think those are becoming more illegal now because of the effects that has on the body and such. But it's just, they have all these benefits, like in terms of trying to convince the psychology of the human to purchase and repurchase. And then you look at how these big companies leverage price points. I mean, how, you mentioned Bimbo. I mean, they do such a good job of like, one, having just this amazing set of all these treats, but also if you look at the average price point, you're probably around, like for a single item, probably what, $1.50, $1.75. I mean, that's pretty damn cheap when you consider how expensive a head of organic broccoli is. $4 now, $3, like why wouldn't you go for that one? And of course, like that item also lasts longer. And you get, I mean, I love broccoli, but let me tell you, I don't get the same like weird, awesome feeling after eating broccoli as I do if I were to, eat I don't know, some Toll House cookies. But we all know later on you'll start to feel the after effects and the downstream negative uh, overall systemic feeling after consuming such a shitty piece of quote unquote fuel. And I think that's one thing also to your point of training yourself. Whereas like if I were to go eat a cookie or some cookies, I tell you what, man, like I don't feel good after usually. And I enjoy every minute of it though while I'm eating it, that transient mouth pleasure that I get, but the downstream effects aren't great. And I know that from like not only just like my energy levels, but also like bowel movements, how my stomach feels. And then if you do that enough, you'll start noticing downstream movement consequences of your body composition. Your workouts won't be as good. You might have heartburn. All your body's going to give you all these signals that you shouldn't do that. But for somebody that habituates to these type foods, what I've noticed is they can handle it no problem, like fucking champs. Their system, and I suspect this also has something to do with them cultivating a different set of microbiota. Whereas they do habituate to it and they cultivate a different strains of biota, different essentially terraforming their gut to best process these items. So every time it isn't a complete struggle. And yeah, I think these food companies they're definitely aware of the levers and buttons that their products push at these ancient instincts in us, and it's hard to break away from those, but not impossible. And I think with more left coast cavemen in your life, you'd find this easier as well.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say they have no problem because the research is showing. I know what you mean by that. It's that they can roll through it. Whereas if you're keeping it cave and you eat a Toll House cookie, yeah, debauchery modality has to be mitigated in a certain way. You have to have specific specificity even then within your debauchery modalities when you're a left coast caveman because yeah, it's a lot more like you can't do debauchery like the standard American can or the standard person. So it's up to everybody, and that's why this apex actualization glyph today. It's in order. The thing about it is big CPG could make a big difference, but they don't because of profitability. But the changing of the table is that people are waking up, and it's up to everybody. So help us, join us, join the cave. We have voices that could make a difference as well because we are experts in this field, and our our objective, our mission statement here at leftcoastcaveman.com, supreme being through modern hunting and gathering, but we're making it more practical and accessible, making health, wellness, well-being, the wellness industry more practical and accessible to people. And it shouldn't cost an arm and a leg. It shouldn't be reserved only for the elite or the esoteric. It should be available to everybody, and it could be available to everybody. And we don't need to be consuming foods with all these toxic ingredients and plastics and all of this stuff in it. We could make a difference, and that's why joining us, join the cave, coming together as one large apex actualization community is our mission, making it practical and accessible for everybody. Because I think at the end of that, people then are guided by making different decisions, as you like to say, judging with their wallet, judging with their dollar, and then the world becomes supreme collectively.
Oh, that was a good ender.
Good. All right. Well, keep it cave, my dear friend. And
All right, until next time.
till next time. See ya.
Bye.